Welcome to the archive, Lesley. We're talking
Thank
about
you.
Halloween today.
Yay.
And you've been writing about Halloween really since the holiday expanded and blew up in a whole different direction, going all the way back to the 80s.
Right. Until, mid 20th century, it definitely was a holiday for kids in this country anyway. And it was mainly a holiday for kids because we had so many kids. There were all those baby boomers, and the whole culture kind of pointed towards kids and went, what can we do with all these kids? But in the 70s, adults got back into Halloween, maybe because they missed it, because they had a wonderful time as kids and wanted to recreate it, um, because they enjoyed horror movies, and there was a whole explosion of Halloween themed horror movies that started in the late 70s and the 80s. And the holiday just got more, I don't know, more bloody, more adult, more visually dangerous, as we did, as our culture did, because Halloween kind of rides the wave. So
Yeah.
it completely changed. And then there was a backlash against that. And then Halloween got more sexy, and there was a backlash against that. And now Halloween is just like spreading out in all sorts of different directions and throughout the world. So it's been really interesting to watch that happen.
Yeah, that's very interesting, on the international bit as well. So what are your favorite countries to see that Halloween's expanded to?
Well, it's interesting. It's kind of it follows American youth culture for the most part. At first it was bars that served Guinness got these promotional packages from Ireland that said, Halloween is this Irish holiday. Let's decorate your bar, bring the people in. It's Halloween, it's Irish, drink Guinness. And American school teachers looking for things to do with their kids would talk about Halloween in foreign countries. And on American army bases, there was Halloween and trick or treating. But then movies, television, American pop culture just started to saturate the rest of the world. So where you see countries that love American youth culture, like South Africa or Hong Kong, you see Halloween starting to come up and be celebrated. And in countries where they have a really strong tradition of All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, which are the same time as Halloween, you see not so much. It's like, we have this. We do this. We go to the graveyard. We visit our dead relatives. We don't need pumpkins and scarecrows and witches.
So Halloween, you saw start to go into the adult direction. Before it started expanding into an area where adults now get back into the holiday, either if it's visually dangerous and it's a good time for a scare, or this opposite direction where people want to get their sexy on and go out and party. Um, what might Halloween had looked like previously? Because I keep seeing that there was a point where there was a mischief night and children were a burden to society, and apparently it got so bad, there was a reaction to it where people started going, "Hey, let's try and bribe these kids with candy to behave."
Right.
Um,
Right.
so what might
Yes.
it have looked like in its earlier days, in its earlier incarnation?
Okay. If you want to go back in America here, 20th century, early 20th century, you're totally right. Or late 19th, Halloween was all about pranks. They're called pranks once and then vandalism later. So pranks at first. So, in the olden days, putting molasses on the church pews, or painting the church steps black, or tarring the principal's house, or piling stones in the middle of the road so cars couldn't get by, freeing cows, putting rocking chairs in trees, all that kind of stuff was what our great grandfathers were doing. And then as the 20th century dawns and there's more people, and the tricks got more in the lines of ringing doorbells, toilet papering trees, throwing eggs, still stealing stuff, stealing street signs, tying opposite apartment doors together so that neither person can get out in apartment buildings. Um, Kids are inventive. And so it was all about treats. Then, I mean, tricks. Then came World War II, and everybody got on board. And there was a shortage of sugar. There was not so much candy, and there was a lot of tension because everyone was required to, or everyone wanted to support the war effort. So vandalism was not okay. Setting little fires was not okay. Letting the air out of tires was not okay. So as a culture, we kind of turned against pranking, and pranking kind of turned more violent and more towards vandalism. So it got so widespread after World War II that everybody said, "Stop! We got to stop this." The town fathers and mothers said, "Let's bring the kids inside where we can see them." And first they tried parties. Everybody threw a party, dancing schools, churches, schools, mothers clubs, Kiwanis, moose lodges. Everyone had a Halloween party. Let's get our arms around these kids and keep them in one place until it's time for bed. That didn't work so much. The only thing that really worked was, okay, they're out, they're banging on your door, they're throwing things at the door, they're accosting you on the street with bags of flowers so that they, whap the flour on your back and turn you into a powdery mess. Let's have candy for them and let's just do this. And it took a long time for us all to get on board with it because lots of people thought it was like bribery, and they just didn't like it. Extortion. And so it took a long time for all Americans to turn on their porch lights, and this was in the 50s and 60s when we finally all accepted that this is what Halloween was, and this is working. This is working. This is fun for the kids. All we have to do is give them candy, and our property is a little more safe. However, you're right that there was still a mischief night. So there's a little vestige of it.
Yeah.
I don't know if kids today grow up thinking they can do anything wrong on Halloween. I think they just grow up, they just don't know. They don't know what their grandfathers and great grandfathers and grandmothers were doing on Halloween. They just think you put on a costume, you go get candy. It's a great holiday. It's just kind of been erased out of it.
Yeah. Um, funny enough that you say that. I remember from a kid into a teenager is like only really the kids that would get in trouble were the ones that participated in mischief night. And there's definitely like a really culturally unappealing thing even amongst kids about messing with people's decorations, throwing someone's pumpkin out, uh, those kinds of things.
Yeah. You're right. It doesn't quite happen anymore. It's like we all wear seatbelts and we all pick up after our dogs. There's been a real shift towards a kind of nice responsibility towards each other's property anyway, a little for the most part. Because I remember when I was growing up, we had to protect our pumpkins because kids would come and just haul them off and smash them in the streets, and that's what happened. And the fathers would chase them, and that was the fun of it. But I put pumpkins in my yard starting in September, and never has one been touched.
Which is nice. That does have its perks. At least you don't need to get a barbed wire fence to keep your pumpkin safe now, or a guard dog. Um, but also, so I mean, what were kind of like the first costumes that people were doing? Was it all homemade? Did anyone actually get in on wanting to make masks?
Yeah. Well, yeah, they started out homemade because there was no stuff. There was no mass merchandising when Halloween was first celebrated in America, which was kind of Civil War and afterwards. So you were making your own costume, and usually it was old clothes and your dad's stuff. And then maybe people made the weirdest masks out of what they had. Like buckram is what they used to make hats out of, and there's all these masks in the early 20th century that are these featureless, creepy faces that people used to make and wear. And frankly, they're scarier than the things that you see now. They're just so rudimentary and creepy or out of paper. But yes, early masks were handmade. They were really creepy. They were made out of cardboard and brown paper and buckram and anything they could find. And when American marketing and manufacturing got into it, which is early 20th century, then all of a sudden we had a popular culture that looked alike. It looked, everybody was doing the same colors and the same images. All the witches and cats and pumpkins and orange and black came out of these early decorations. They were paper first, even costumes. And then as larger companies got into it and saw the market, they became, things made out of plastic and then really nice things like adult costumes, Star Wars costumes with the incredible details that you can buy now for $300, $400. So it just kind of upped the quality of costumes over the 20th century and the mass market appeal. So now, your Spirit Halloween stores are kind of astonishing in the range of stuff that they have for costumes, because I mean, they don't really know. Halloween responds so quickly to what's going on in the culture that even in Spirit, which they can make a costume like that, they still have to kind of plan ahead and they don't know what's going to happen. For example, the hurricane that just happened, that would have been an event that shows up in costumes maybe. After big storms, sometimes people are dressed as tornadoes and rainstorms and earthquakes and things like that. So Halloween costumes comment on what's going on immediately. And I think to some extent people still make their costumes because you can respond in the moment. Whereas with the store-bought costume, you have to go with what they decided
Okay.
was going to be important. And they hedged their bets. Did you see the Saturday Night Live spoof on Spirit Halloween? No?
I did not.
Okay, it was very good. It was very good. And they were showing a cost. This isn't real, but this is a very good satire on it. It was a costume of blonde-haired popular singer with guitar. Oh, to avoid the trademark for Taylor Swift, they do a generic thing. That happens because that's how they have to make their costumes, to be as flexible as possible.
Yeah, actually, that does come to mind that a couple of years ago, people did, as a joke on social media, they would make themselves like a spirit costume. Um, I started noticing everyone was like, they were suddenly like awkward lifeguard, uh, like socially poor fashion choice, EMT, um, book nerd. There's just all these funny ways for people to make fun of themselves.
Yes. And it's funny that you mentioned that, because that kind of sticks the knife in what Halloween is really all about. Is it because it doesn't celebrate anything specific like Christmas, Easter, St. Patrick's Day. It can ride the cultural waves and be a different thing to a different person to a different year, and it reflects who we are and what we value. And what I'm seeing is exactly what you mentioned, is that this particular cultural wave is about satire and irony and humor. So it's like, this is what we need right now. We need something to lighten up what's going on in the rest of the world, and you can see it on Halloween, and something to show that we've still got a live beating heart in there. We still can react to things in a fun and smart way. So I don't know.
Yeah, that is a really interesting thing that hadn't really crossed my mind. Um, that this is something in terms of pop culture, we can just sort of react to whatever's going on in the backyard, on the internet, ourselves,
Yeah,
and manage to have a good time
yeah,
doing that. I'm so caught up in either the history of the holiday, either if it's the traditional roots of the holiday, the pre-Christian roots of the holiday, or um, the horror movies, because
Mhm.
clearly I don't watch horror movies at all. Um, and that, uh, yeah, I didn't really think it never crossed my mind that it was like this fun way for people to go, hey, let's just, you know, react to what's going on, or there was a social commentary as to what was happening. I remember in college there were all these smart costumes based on things that were popular from what was happening in social media. Like I remember there's this whole meme on one of the dancers in Katy Perry's Super Bowl performance where there are two sharks dancing and one did the wrong move and it was called left shark because it was on her left.
I remember that. Left Shark. Yes. And because of the internet and because of social media, we can all get on the same page in about 2 seconds, which is like the main function of holidays in general is to get everybody on the same page for one day, which is the good that they do. And it happens so much faster these days. I mean, you mentioned ancient Halloween, and I was thinking a little bit because you were asking about, how where it comes from, and is there anything from its old origins that still exists, or something to that effect? And I was thinking about that, and I'm thinking, yeah, yeah. I mean, of course, the precursor to Halloween in northwestern Europe was Samhain, which is the summer's end, and this was a time when the tribes would gather together and actually, it was more like our Thanksgiving. They would gather together, eat, drink, slaughter the animals. They had food in November 1st, and brag and play and wrestle and play competitive games and tell ghost stories. So there's this little supernatural thread that comes out of that you hear a lot about when people talk about Samhain. It's just a part of it, but it's the part that's kind of gone through all the years because when the church moved their All Saints and All Souls to November 1st and 2nd, it built on that. It didn't replace it. A lot of people say it was there to knock it out. Not so much. The Irish people were fine with both ghosts and saints. Those are fine. Those are kind of birds of a feather.
Yeah. Yeah, the early days of Ireland, I just had Sally North on to talk about Ireland's magical history. And she talked about, she said, yeah, it didn't really happen in 5 minutes. Like everyone, when Ireland became Christianized, like everyone likes to think so. But even in its early years, Christian Ireland, you still see documentations of these people identified in magical practice of
Absolutely.
pre-Christian names like witches and druids. And
Yep.
yeah, they were very open to that.
Yes, well, it makes sense. They're similar. The supernatural kinds of supernatural beings. They're not so dissimilar. Um, Even in like the 19th century and 20th century, early 20th century folklore collections from Ireland, the folklorists found people who told stories about the dead and the departed coming around the fire at Halloween to see if anyone was praying for them. So it still exists, that cross, of the dead coming back and are you praying for me? So are you praying? And I'm still here. Those things went together with All Saints, All Souls, and Halloween. They just meshed kind of beautifully together, which reinforced that idea that we have an interactive relationship with the dead. And we kind of celebrate that at Halloween. We used to celebrate it at Christmas and tell ghost stories, but those all moved to Halloween when Christmas was made more tame. It went from a drunken brawl to a family centered religious gift giving holiday a
Yeah.
couple, 150 years ago. And Halloween got the ghost stories.
Halloween got all the ghost stories. That probably because of that no good wretched Saturnalia. People do all sorts of crazy things
Too.
where Saturn makes his ominous appearance. Um, so the ghost story bit, when does that start to integrate into Halloween?
Yeah. I think, well, with the church putting All Souls Day on November 2nd, which was around 1,000, that was a time to remember the dead and pray for the dead, and you still see that everywhere in Catholic countries on that day. All Souls Day is really important, but it put it at this time of year where we're going into the dark season and thoughts do turn to what's out there in the dark and what is death and how permanent is it? And so all that goes together to create mythology and folklore that have to do with the dead returning. So even though All Souls Day is a Catholic thing, you find on Halloween a lot of literature and folklore about people you've lost coming back to see you on Halloween. And that's why you put a lantern or a candle in the window. And that's why you put a chair out in case they come visit you that night, because this is the night of the year that they're free to do that. And I think that got very romanticized in Europe and northwestern Europe. And when the immigrants came here, bringing their folklore with them, it got all combined with African folklore and German folklore because we were just all these people together. So you got some really wonderful Halloween ghost stories that were kind of German or African or Irish all put together. Like, for example, of the black cat bone is really important in folklore on Halloween in the early 20th century. And that's not Irish and it's not entirely African, but it's a mix of the two, the black cat and the bone. And I guess the feeling is if you find a black cat and boil it and take its bones, you can put each bone through your lips, and the one that screams is your magic cat bone, and that will make you invisible. So you can see it's like all different folklore come together. You can see everybody in the kitchen whispering late at night, all the domestic Irish servants and the African American slaves just telling each other stuff, going, yeah, yeah, and then, and then, and then. And that's what we get. We end up with this wonderfully rich Halloween ghost stories, monster stories, weird, eerie tales.
I love it. Just love it. Got to have more of those stories going around on Halloween now.
Well, you mentioned spiritualism. It was after the Civil War when everyone got interested in the dead that Halloween became actually popular in America. Until then, it was kind of an ethnic holiday, Irish, Scottish, Welsh, English to some extent. Um, but after the Civil War, when everyone had lost someone and they didn't know if they were dead or alive, were they coming back? Then they went to mediums, and spiritualism had, as you know, a rise in popularity. And this interest in the dead kind of bolstered the celebration of Halloween because people at that time found this old, quaint holiday from Europe, which they thought was exotic and wonderful, that had to do with ghosts, which they were very interested in, and the dead. And they started to adopt it and throw Halloween parties. It happened after the Civil War.
Had to celebrate whatever life you had left.
Yes.
That is really cool.
Yeah.
So what did it look like going from this holiday of kids and let's bribe kids into behaving well and rewarding their good actions with candy and not pranking people? You got to see it take this dramatic shift where then it started getting more dark and there's horror movies coming out like Halloween. And then you also got to see where suddenly there's this added sexy party element added to it. What was that like when those things started hitting the market?
You know, it's interesting. It follows pop culture a lot. Halloween follows pop culture a lot. And so when you have slasher movies and all the franchises, Freddy, Jason, Mike Myers, um, you have the costumes follow suit and Halloween follow suit. And when the movies get more explicit and more, the special effects get better, we had a whole group of Halloween lovers out there, adults who wanted to recreate that in their yards. And the internet was the thing that moved the needle and made yard decorating explode because somebody in Seattle knows how to make a skeleton out of pool noodles, and somebody in, Poughkeepsie can make really cheap fake blood. And they get together in these chat rooms on the internet and give each other do-it-yourself tips. And all of a sudden, the home decorating phenomenon just popped up. And so in the 80s and 90s, everybody could put something really cool in their yard. And it just bolstered this kind of scary Halloween because they were trying to be like the movies. And to an extent, Halloween is theater. It's we perform it for each other. You have a set, you have lights, you have costumes. So you make this in your front yard and then you populate it with actors. Some people did, their moms, their dads, their kids, and create this whole experience for the trick-or-treaters that are coming by.
Lovely. Yeah, there's even not far from me, in the city of Portsmouth. There's this famous Halloween house where it's just this mom and daughter tag team duo that would create the wildest setups. They had this famous animatronic dog house and this undead dog called Fluffy. And when I was working in public access at the time at the TV station there, um, because it was the final year, they made this big documentary on it.
Oh, wow. Wow. Have you been to Haunted Overload up in Lee, New Hampshire?
I have a few times Haunted Overload.
You know, he started in his front yard and they got a little big, as you can imagine.
Very big, very big. Oh my. Yeah. So that was neat that not only the horror movies were dynamic and expanding, but
Yes.
there was people recreating it on top of that. Um,
And
and
as far as sexy costumes, you asked about that. Sorry, you asked about sexy costumes. That again was just kind of a cultural shift. I don't know if you noticed, but in the early 2000s, fashion got more low cut and
Mhm.
shorter. And it was just in our culture, newscasters for the first time were dressing like that. So it was everywhere. And little girls always want to be older. And there was plenty of costumes and materials for them to play at that. So that happened because there was a desire for it. And that's the way the culture looked, and people wanted to be like that. And then you get the backlash to it after we all beg for it and we get it, then you get the backlash that says, "Oh my gosh, this is horrible. Look at these little girls dressed as sexy nurses." Well, we did that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Did you want to take a minute while we have one? Is there anything else you'd like to mention?
There is something very generous about Halloween. It's the only holiday we have left where we open our doors to strangers. We don't Christmas carol anymore. I just think there's an incredible value in supporting the holiday, which is why I talk about it a lot and write about it a lot. It just seems like the one day a year where we can take everything that is dark and nasty and scary and put our arms around it and make fun of it. And it seems to me, it's always been for me a very light filled holiday rather than a dark one because of that, because it's not dark. It's the day you put a little light in that darkness. And that's why I love it so much.
Wonderful. All right, Lesley, thank you so much for coming on and talking about Halloween.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.